This is the story of how nearly 4 million tons of a nut that comes sealed inside a caustic, skin-blistering poison every single year gets turned into one of the world's most popular snacks, through a process so labor-intensive that no country has ever managed to fully automate it. Picture a single drop of thick, reddish-brown liquid seeping out of a cracked cashew shell and eating clean through a rubber glove in seconds. Cashews grow in the same plant family as poison ivy, and the chemical hiding inside their shell is a close chemical cousin of the exact compound that gives poison ivy its sting. That's not a minor footnote. It's the entire reason a cashew never reaches a store still wearing its shell, and the reason turning it into a snack requires an industrial detox process almost nobody thinks about while they're eating a handful at a party.
Here's the part that surprises almost everyone. Roughly half of the world's raw cashews grow in West Africa, in countries like Côte d'Ivoire and Benin. But the work of detoxifying, cracking, and peeling nearly every one of them happens thousands of miles away, in factories across Vietnam and India. Two industries split apart by an ocean, and one of them still does the most dangerous part of the job almost entirely by hand. Global raw cashew production sits at close to 3.93 million metric tons a year, according to the UN's FAO. More than 10 Empire State Buildings worth of a single nut, grown and harvested fresh every single year. Once you account for how much shell and skin get stripped away in processing, that raw harvest boils down to somewhere around 1 million tons of actual edible kernel, the part anyone ever eats, in a market worth somewhere around $8 billion once it's processed and sold. That's not a small crop. It's a nut so labor-intensive to prepare that it commands a price most other nuts can only envy, and a supply chain that stretches across 3 continents before a single kernel reaches a supermarket shelf. Côte d'Ivoire alone grows over 1 million tons of raw cashews a year, more than a quarter of the world's entire supply, making it the single largest cashew-growing country on Earth. India follows at around 782,000 tons, then Vietnam at roughly 348,000. Add up every West African country together: Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, Guinea, Mali, and the region accounts for something close to half of everything grown worldwide. Cambodia complicates that picture further. The country exported over 815,000 tons of raw cashews in 2024 alone, enough to rank among the world's largest suppliers. Yet it barely registers in official global production statistics at all, a sign of just how recent and fast Cambodia's cashew boom has been, and how far the world's data collection still lags behind the industry's real shape on the ground. And yet, almost none of that raw West African harvest gets turned into a finished snack anywhere near where it's grown. Vietnam alone exported more than 720,000 tons of processed cashew kernels in 2024, worth over $4.3 billion, a 15th consecutive, 16th running year at the top of the world's kernel export rankings. India processes even more nuts than it grows, importing raw material from elsewhere to feed factories that serve its own enormous domestic market. Two countries, on the opposite side of the planet from where the crop actually grows, doing almost all of the work that turns a poisonous shell into something safe to eat. Here's the problem nobody solves by simply picking the fruit. A cashew doesn't grow the way most nuts do. It hangs off the bottom of a soft, pear-shaped fruit called a cashew apple, dangling on the outside like an afterthought, sealed inside a hard, honeycomb-structured shell. And packed into that shell structure is a thick, caustic liquid called CNSL, cashew nutshell liquid. CNSL isn't a minor irritant. Its main components, anacardic acid and cardinol, are alkyl phenols with long chemical tails that are structurally close relatives of urushiol, the exact compound responsible for the rash from poison ivy and poison oak. That's not a coincidence. The cashew tree belongs to the Anacardiaceae family, the same botanical family as poison ivy, poison sumac, and, somewhat less alarmingly, mango. Direct contact with CNSL causes real chemical burns and blistering, a documented clinical condition doctors call cashew nutshell liquid poisoning. Even the smoke from roasting untreated shells can irritate the eyes and lungs. Which means a cashew can never simply be cracked open and eaten fresh. the way you'd crack a walnut or a pistachio. The shell has to be neutralized first, heat-treated to break down the very liquid that's protecting the seed inside, before anyone can safely touch what's underneath. Skip that step, and the reward for opening a cashew shell with your bare hands is a chemical burn, not a snack. That single fact is the whole reason an otherwise ordinary-looking nut needs a dedicated industrial process before it can ever reach a bowl on your coffee table, and why, as it turns out, an entire global industry has organized itself around solving a problem most people don't even know exists. Cashews aren't native to Africa or Asia at all. The tree originated in Brazil, and Portuguese traders carried it across the world in the 16th century, planting it in their colonial ports partly to control soil erosion. India was one of the first places it took root, and by the late 1920s, India had become the world's first serious commercial cashew processor, building the shelling and peeling know-how that the rest of the industry would later copy. For most of the 20th century, that gave India a head start nobody else had. But the real split between where cashews are grown and where they're processed didn't fully take shape until Vietnam entered the picture decades later and did something India's industry never fully committed to. It mechanized. Vietnamese processors invested heavily in rotating drum steamers that cook batches of 640 kilograms of nuts at a time, and automated shelling machines capable of cracking somewhere between 100 and 700 kilograms of nuts an hour with minimal kernel breakage. Some modern Vietnamese plants now run with as few as 30 employees processing over 50,000 kilograms of nuts a day, a throughput that would have taken hundreds of hand-shellers a generation earlier. India, meanwhile, stayed largely hand-powered. Roughly 82% of Indian cashew processing is still done manually, compared to an estimated 40% in Vietnam, partly a matter of capital and partly a deliberate choice. Cashew processing is one of the largest sources of rural employment for women in states like Kerala, and mechanizing it away would mean gutting an entire regional labor market. Vietnam chased throughput. India chased jobs.
Both choices shaped an entire global industry, and neither one happened anywhere near the West African farms where most of the raw material actually grows. There's a surprising twist buried in India's numbers, too. India accounts for something like 36% of the world's total cashew processing capacity, more than almost anywhere else on Earth, and yet it exported only around 65,808 tons of kernels in the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year, worth roughly $339 million. Compare that to Vietnam's 720,000 plus tons. India isn't processing less than Vietnam. It's exporting almost none of what it processes, because the country's own domestic market quietly eats most of it before it ever reaches a port. None of this mechanization actually solved the hardest step in the whole process. Steaming and shelling can be automated.
Peeling the thin, papery skin still clinging to each kernel after shelling, called the testa, largely cannot, not without damaging or breaking the kernel itself. And that single stubborn step is where the human cost of this industry becomes impossible to ignore. In September 2011, Human Rights Watch published a report called The Rehab Archipelago, documenting forced labor inside Vietnam's government-run drug detention centers, an estimated 40,000 people held across roughly 123 facilities at the time. Detainees were made to work 6 days a week under threat of punishment, and one center's own director named a specific company, Sun Long JSC, overseeing cashew processing work performed inside his facility. One detainee told researchers that contact with the shell's liquid left a burn. That single report is where the phrase blood cashews comes from. The physical toll shows up in more places than one investigation. A peer-reviewed study out of a factory in Bobo Dioulasso, Burkina Faso, documented real skin damage and disfigurement in women working the hand-shelling chain. Burns and blistering from direct CNSL contact, recorded with photographic evidence. In January 2023, the French outlet France 24 investigated similar hand disfigurement among cashew workers in Kilifi County, Kenya, describing what workers there sometimes call cashew oil burns. Across every country where hand shelling and hand peeling remain the norm, the same pattern keeps surfacing. Workers, disproportionately women, in close, repeated contact with a corrosive liquid, often without gloves that are either unavailable or too expensive, or that slow down piece rate pay enough that workers skip them anyway. Some of the industry has tried to respond. Fair Trade International maintains a specific cashew standard covering hand-shelling operations, requiring protective measures, encouraging simple barriers like gloves or even castor oil rubbed onto the skin before handling shells, and guaranteeing a social premium paid on top of the base price. It's a real, documented attempt to put guardrails on the most dangerous part of the job. But there's no evidence of any large-scale industry effort to mechanize peeling specifically to protect workers. Where automation has happened, in Vietnam, it happened to cut costs and boost output, not to solve a labor safety problem. The two motivations get blurred together in a lot of casual retelling of this industry's story. They shouldn't be. Strip away the geography and the politics, and the physical journey from tree to bag is a sequence of very specific, very deliberate steps, each one solving a problem the step before it created. It starts with the harvest. Cashew apples, with the nut still attached at the bottom, are picked by hand, or gathered after they drop, and the nut is separated from the fruit almost immediately, because the apple itself is fragile and doesn't ship well. In places like Goa, India, that discarded fruit doesn't go completely to waste. It gets fermented into a strong local liquor called feni. Brazil goes much further with it. The country grows roughly 2.7 million tons of cashew apples a year, 8 or 9 times more fruit than nut by weight, and a dozen major juice factories there process well over 200,000 tons of it annually into a clarified, caramel-colored beverage called Cashewina, first developed in the 1890s and still sold today under commercial names like Cashewina São Geraldo. Even with a real industry built around it, Brazilian researchers estimate close to 90% of the fruit still goes to waste, which tells you something about just how completely the nut, not the fruit, has always been the point of growing this tree. The nut is the product here. Once separated, the raw nuts are sun-dried down to roughly 9% moisture, which is what makes them stable enough to store as raw cashew nut, or RCN, the form in which most of West Africa's harvest crosses an ocean before any real processing happens at all. At the factory, the nuts go through a cooking stage designed to do exactly one thing: break down the CNSL trapped in the shell before anyone has to touch it directly. Indian processors traditionally use static cooking kettles. Vietnamese plants favor rotating drum steamers loaded with those 640-kilogram batches, run for roughly 20 to 25 minutes under steam and pressure. Either way, the shell comes out of that stage softened and chemically calmer, the caustic threat inside it neutralized enough to handle. Then comes the shelling, cracking the softened shell to free the kernel. In India, this is still frequently done with hand-operated cutting tools, worker by worker. In Vietnam's larger operations, machines now do the job at rates between 100 and 700 kilograms an hour, engineered specifically to crack the shell without shattering the kernel inside it. The kernels that come out still wear a thin brown skin, and they go through a second drying stage, called Borma drying, that brings their moisture down from around 7% to about 3%, both for shelf stability and to prepare that skin for removal. That skin removal is the step nobody has fully mechanized. Kernels are briefly rehumidified with steam or a light water spray for 30 to 90 seconds, just enough to loosen the papery testa without softening the kernel itself. And then, in the vast majority of factories worldwide, a worker peels it away by hand, finishing with a small knife for anything stubborn. It's the most repetitive, most physically demanding stage in the entire chain, and it's exactly the stage where CNSL residue still lingering on the shell fragments does most of its damage to skin. From there, kernels are graded by size, color, and quality. Industry categories like W180, W240, and W320 for whole kernels, down to pieces and splits for anything broken along the way, sorted visually by hand in most of the world. The larger Vietnamese plants increasingly use optical and mechanical sorters. Finally, because cashew kernels are unusually high in unsaturated fat and go rancid quickly once exposed to air, they're packed into vacuum-sealed tins or gas-flushed bags before they ever leave the building. There's one more twist most people never hear about. The caustic liquid removed from every shell isn't simply dumped. Companies like Cardolite, a multinational chemical manufacturer with plants in India and China, have spent more than 40 years capturing CNSL and refining it into cardinal-based resins used in automotive brake pads, clutch linings, paints, and varnishes, turning the same corrosive compound that burns a worker's skin into a heat-resistant industrial polymer worth several $100 million a year globally. The exact chemical defense that makes a cashew shell dangerous to crack open is, once captured correctly, valuable enough to build a separate global industry on its own. Every stage in that sequence exists to solve a problem the cashew itself creates. A shell that poisons anyone who opens it carelessly. A kernel that spoils if it's not dried just right. A skin that won't come off without a human hand and a fair amount of patience. Multiply that patience by nearly 4 million tons of raw material a year, and you start to understand why this snack costs what it costs. For decades, the economics of this industry ran almost exclusively one direction. West Africa grew the nuts, and Vietnam and India captured almost all the value of turning them into something sellable. The math behind that gap is stark. Getting 1 kilogram of edible kernel takes roughly 4 to 4.5 kilograms of raw in-shell nuts, because of how the kernel-to-shell ratio works out. A West African farmer selling that much raw material at around 65 cents a kilogram earns something like $2.90 for the exact quantity of nuts that eventually becomes a single kilogram of kernel. A kilogram that retails in a Western supermarket for anywhere from about $7.50 to over $10 once it's processed, packaged, and shipped. That gap hasn't gone unnoticed. The United Nations trade body, UNCTAD, has published commentary bluntly titled, "Cashing in on Cashews, Africa Must Add Value to Its Nuts," an institutional acknowledgement that the raw material end of this business has never been the profitable end. Côte d'Ivoire is now trying to close that gap itself. The country's own domestic processing capacity grew from just 68,515 tons in 2015 to 350,000 tons by 2024, and the number of active processing plants climbed from 17 to more than 35 over roughly the same period. The government's stated target is to process half of its own raw cashew harvest domestically by 2030, up from around a quarter today. A World Bank-financed initiative called the Cashew Value Chain Competitiveness Project, backed by $200 million in financing, reports having helped create over 18,000 jobs in the country's processing sector, 2/3 of them held by women, alongside nearly 1,800 kilometers of rehabilitated access roads connecting farms to processing plants. At an investment forum in Abidjan in September 2024, the country's Cotton and Cashew Council secured $28 million in fresh commitments from international companies, specifically to build out more local processing capacity. The government has even carved out an exclusive early buying window each year, from late January through mid-March, reserved for domestic processors, before raw nut exporters are allowed to compete for the harvest at all. Benin went further still. In April 2024, the government banned the export of raw cashew nuts outright, forcing the country's entire harvest through domestic processing at a purpose-built facility called the Glo Jigbe Industrial Zone, which already had capacity to handle over 130,000 tons a year, with a target of 150,000 tons by 2026. That kind of policy doesn't close every loophole, though. In the same year Benin's export ban took effect, Vietnam and India recorded receiving 224,000 tons of raw cashews, credited to neighboring Togo, a figure roughly 9 times larger than Togo's own actual production capacity. The likeliest explanation, based on the trade numbers alone, is that a significant volume of Beninese cashews got rerouted across the border and relabeled before making the same trip east that they always had. Building a law is one thing. Enforcing it across a porous regional border is another problem entirely, and one West Africa's processing push hasn't fully solved yet. Run the numbers against where this industry started, and the shift is real, even if it's still incomplete. A decade ago, Côte d'Ivoire processed a small fraction of its own cashew harvest and shipped almost everything else raw. Today, its domestic processing capacity has grown roughly 5-fold, from 68,515 tons to 350,000 tons, backed by more than 35 operating plants where there used to be 17. 18,000 new jobs, two-thirds of them held by women, now exist in a part of the supply chain that used to belong almost wholly to factories on the other side of the planet. Benin's export ban is blunter, but just as telling. Rather than continuing to sell its raw harvest to Vietnamese and Indian buyers, the entire country now funnels its cashews through one purpose-built industrial zone, aiming to more than double its processing capacity within a couple of years. None of that has dethroned Vietnam, which still exported over 720,000 tons of processed kernels, worth more than $4.3 billion in 2024 alone. Still the largest kernel exporter on Earth for the 16th year running. And it hasn't erased the human cost documented inside hand-peeling operations from Kerala to Kilifi County to the drug detention centers named in that 2011 Human Rights Watch report. But the economics of this industry, once locked in one direction for the better part of a century, are visibly starting to bend. West Africa isn't just growing the raw material anymore. Piece by piece, plant by plant, it's starting to keep more of what that material is actually worth. Strip away the factories and the trade statistics, and what's left is a strange kind of dependency built entirely on a plant's own defense mechanism. The exact chemical that makes a cashew shell too dangerous to crack open by hand is also the reason an entire global industry exists to crack it open anyway, carefully, at scale, continent by continent, for as long as people have wanted to eat what's hiding underneath. Which answers the question this whole story started with. Every bag of raw cashews on a supermarket shelf has already been steamed, shelled, dried, and peeled long before it reached that bag. There's no such thing as a truly raw cashew sitting in a store, because a truly raw one would still be sealed inside its own poison. The nut you're used to snacking on has already survived an entire hidden industrial process on the other side of the planet from where it grew, just to earn the right to be called a snack at all. The nut hasn't changed. Its shell is exactly as caustic today as it was when Portuguese traders first carried the tree across the ocean 5 centuries ago.
What's changed is who does the dangerous work, who profits from it, and, slowly, unevenly, one processing plant at a time, whether the countries that actually grow the crop finally get to keep more of what it's worth. If stories like this, where an ordinary snack turns out to hide an entire hidden industry behind it, are what you come here for, subscribe. Because next time, we're cracking open a completely different raw material and the surprisingly complicated journey it takes before it ever reaches your hands.